Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Yelena Biberman, and I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council South Asia Center, as well as an associate professor of political science at Skidmore College in New York. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's program, in which we will discuss the implications of the Taliban's newly announced interim government and political developments in Afghanistan. Before we get any further, I want to take a moment and highlight our co-hosts on this program, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and thank them for their continuing partnership with the Atlantic Council on engaging these issues. Recently, after taking over Afghanistan and declaring it an Islamic emirate, the Taliban announced its interim government and acting cabinet members. These members are all male, all Taliban, with some remaining on various terrorism and blacklists by the United States and the United Nations. Such developments come as the Taliban rhetorically proclaim a moderate agenda, despite actions that suggest otherwise, particularly with regards to the inclusion and rights of women and girls, Afghanistan's many ethnic and religious minorities, and the intersectional groups within. To discuss the implications of these announcements, I'm joined by two esteemed panelists. Dr. Nilofar Sakhi, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council South Asia Center, as well as the Director of Policy and Diplomacy at McColm & Company. She's also a professional lecturer at the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. And we also have Mr. Rateb Noori, who is a Kabul chief editor for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Afghanistan Service, locally known as Radio Azadi. He previously worked with agency France Press and Tolu News in Kabul, reporting on Afghanistan and the region. So with that, let's just jump right in. My first question to the panel: with the new Taliban cabinet being all male, all Taliban, and offering no participation to women and diverse ethnic groups, how do you think this will impact international legitimacy of the group that the group is trying to gain, as well as its domestic legitimacy?
Who do you want?
Well, let's start with Dr. Sakhi.
All right, thank you, Yelena, and thank you for having me here today. Well, first of all, let me start with the nature of the interim system that they have put in place, the interim government that they have put in place. Well, the government that Taliban put together recently, last week, is far from inclusive. As you clearly highlighted, it does not include, it is not representative first, representative of different ethnic groups. There's no gender inclusion, there's no ideological inclusion, there is no sect inclusion. Afghanistan has sects as well, and it's not included as well. So it's by far, it's just the most authoritative and exclusive system that they put in place. So by nature, it's an authoritative system. It is actually an authoritative only in a sense that it's consists of almost entirely of old guard and hardliner Pashtun men. So it's exclusive. It doesn't have any inclusivity involved, and that was expected. You know, it was kind of and I think it's not shocking for the world. It's not shocking for all of us. Who think that Taliban haven't changed, right? And I think it further confirms the whole concept behind that Taliban have not changed, and they still believe on the system of governance that they used to put in place from 1996 to 2001. So one can make a lot from and predict a lot from their governance system going forward, from on the basis of what they have recently established. So yes, it will be authoritative, though they said that the other positions will be filled by other ethnic groups, but I don't think that the influential positions will be filled by other ethnic group, or women will be included. So it will remain an inclusive system, an exclusive system going forward, where people will not see their presence in the politics, and overall people will lose momentum to invest. They will feel security and safety threats from their own society. And that gives a lot of image of the system to the people, where it impedes people participation in every sector in society, and reduces the momentum among the population to stay and work hard and look for a better life in Afghanistan. So that's an internal impact. And on the other hand, the internal impact, the impact of this particular system on the population in large would be, in the long term, it could create a resistance. It would create pockets of resistance from across the country, because people will not see their participation in politics. They will lose sense of identity. You know, there are a lot of theoretical frame that when people don't have their identity needs, they resist. And that resistance can create pockets around the country, pockets of resistance around the country, and organized pockets of resistance around the country, where the outsider, the regional players could benefit from. And that would end, or that could lead to a civil war that many of us were kind of predicting and analyzing from the current situation going forward. So that's an internal impact, which is unfortunately not a good scenario, looking specifically on the basis of the government that they recently created. The external, that goes back to your question, Yelena, is about the legitimacy. Of course, that will give the world another confirmation about the strict and rigid Taliban's taken attitude towards other ethnic group, and towards religious sects, and towards women in particular as well. So and that will further undermine the system that they created. And I don't see really most of the countries, especially in the West, and that calculation is different in the regional countries. But in the West, since these issues are important, I think the legitimacy will be an issue for the Taliban, because most of those countries may not consider or recognize the government of the Taliban going forward. But that is not the case in the region. For countries like China, Russia, that inclusivity or exclusivity will not really matter. For them, security assurances from the Taliban plays an important role for their decision going forward. And I think once they have the security assurance from the Taliban, they will recognize Taliban. That I'm talking specifically about China and Russia, but about the other countries, yes, that would be an issue, and exclusivity of the government would seriously undermine the legitimacy of the Taliban going forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Noori.
Well, thank you. I think most of the things that Dr. Sakhi said, I agree with, and that's the case for them. And one thing to be mentioned, that as Afghan people, at least, I'm happy that they did not have an inclusive government, because then that would have given them, that would have given the world a reason to accept this this government came by force, while US and other partners were saying if they capture Kabul by force, they will not be accepted and legitimized. And that was the only thing that the world was looking for. And still I think there is still a room for that. They're thinking to, as Dr. Sakhi said, to fill in the other remaining ministries with probably ethnicities from other, levels of the society, which will actually not impact or will not have a big influence on preventing, resistance, and that will probably lead to civil war, as you see the history witness that exclusiveness and exclusive governments never actually lasted long in Afghanistan. And this would be one of those examples again that unfortunately will repeat in a while, and we are expecting something bigger to happen from the small resistance in Panjshir that has started already. But the main point is when they legitimize Taliban, which I hope will not happen, then you have victims for that. A big level of society, women and children and youth of Afghanistan will be the victims of the future government if it's recognized worldwide. And also, the amount of achievements we had in past 20 years, that should be considered. And I really hope that at least Western countries, they do a lot and they put all their force to not recognize them unless they accept all the conditions, conditions put to them by the world.
Thank you. So it seems to me you're both predicting instability and potentially civil war. And I was thinking maybe there's some room for hope. And it's sometimes said that hawks have more freedom than doves to negotiate and reconcile with their adversaries without triggering backlash, because they don't have to prove their commitment or credentials. As the saying goes, only Nixon could go to China. So could this be a source of hope? Could a confident Taliban with little to prove, as it is now, be uniquely amenable to making compromises with international communities and domestic rivals as it seeks to build its reputation? What do you think?
Well, knowing Taliban and looking at their previous regime from 1996 to 2004, I'm in particular not really hopeful about their governance system and about the ways that they could convince the international community. Look, from last 3 weeks, almost 4 weeks now, we haven't seen actually lots of changes in their both behavior, attitude, and so-called policies that they have in place. And by the way, there's another thing also, there's fragmentation within Taliban. And we have seen from last 2 weeks when they were in the process of forming their government, putting together this cabinet, there was a lot of fragmentation within them. And there were tribal fragmentation actually. And right now we see that Haqqanis are in power and Mullah Brother on the other end is kind of opposing the composition of this particular system in place. So look, going forward, I would assume that there will be more fragmentation within them, and that will be a recipe of more chaos. Because what I would see based on my follow-up of closely following them from last 2.5 years, that there's hardliner and, they consider some of them as a moderate, the Doha folks, they all consider themselves kind of a moderate, which I don't see any moderation in them. But overall, there is a kind of, among them, it seems that there's a hardliner and moderate Talibs, right? That's how they categorize themselves. And I would see that conflict, we will see more of that kind of conflict going forward in terms of governance, in terms of who will be in different positions, in terms of even the policies that they put in place for the security, for their interaction and relationship with the foreign countries. I would see that's going to come up, that conflict is going to come up between them about those relationships, with whom to make a good relationship, with whom to make to have a strict rules and regulation in terms of relationships. So that's going to come up a lot, because there is not now that we see a united front of the Taliban. They used to present that a lot from last 2.5 years, at least during Doha process. But now we see that those kind of fragmentation are emerging, and that differences are coming up, and that differences will be another recipe for chaos first among them, and that will certainly have its impact on that. So overall, and that is the first. The second thing, there's lack of capability within the Taliban. We have seen last 2.5 years. They never provided a governance plan, an economic development plan, a security plan. They never. There was a lot of questions on them since the beginning of the Doha processes, that what will be your governance strategy? But they were lacking actually that capability and capacity to provide something concrete. I would see that lack of capability even now. Therefore, they rely on their old guard, and the old guard means the revision, the repetition of what they implemented from 1996, 2001. So that lack of capability in governance and economic development, that will also impede a better relationship with the international community, right? So these factors overall does not give us hope for their government going forward. But I would see more recipes of disasters actually, rather than a more recipe for construction of the country.
Those are good points, Dr. Sakhi, about the fragmentation and the inability, lack of plan to provide for the Afghans' basic needs, which are very great right now. Mr. Noori, anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I think now, as we see, the Taliban have become smarter. In what way? In doing good publicity for themselves, and also there is a difference from 90s and now. As you see, they're now surrounded by media, by citizen journalism, and by technology, social media. So they're being super careful to do, to kind of pretend and depict the different picture of themselves to the world, which will not last long again. And you can already see that they don't really have a full control over all their foot soldiers that they used to have. I mean, they used to be united, and now you can see they have different rules, and they're implementing mostly based on their local commanders' orders, whatever they want. And also, on the other hand, there is, when you look at their cabinet, they have Haqqani, which is the right wing of the Taliban and is the closest to ISI. And as you see, as you read the history of Haqqani, they have conducted all sorts of high-profile attacks and complex attacks in Afghanistan usually. And then you have plenty of them in the cabinet, actually 3-4, and then you have other Taliban hardliners who actually were fighting for them and were in leadership board, but now they're in Kabul, including Mullah Omar's sons. And then you have two people from other ethnicities. They may think they have a kind of inclusive cabinet, which is true in their own levels and their own thoughts. And meanwhile, when you look at this formation of the cabinet, and when you, on the other side, when you look at the technology and media they face, and the third point is their control on their foot soldiers. So when you actually put all these points together, then you come to this conclusion that they will not change. It's not easy, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be optimistic at all. I hope I could, like a person, but no, I cannot.
Thank you very much. The point about the foot soldiers and the fragmentation, and there are worries that some might go to other groups outside of the Taliban, including ISIS-K potentially, as well as your point about, the Taliban maybe believe that they are being inclusive, maybe tribally or in their own way. They have potentially a different definition of inclusivity. So my next question, in relation to this, you mentioned sort of historical precedent and looking at Taliban before and learning from that. So we've been studying Islamist movements for decades now and trying to figure out under what conditions they would likely moderate. So what we found is that there are two conditions when Islamist movements could moderate. One is in a condition of democracy, when they have to make coalitions with other groups that would cause them to moderate, right? But another context is authoritarian. In this context, though, historically, it's been a secular government, and these Islamists are in the opposition, and that leads them to moderate. Well, unfortunately, this is not the case in Afghanistan, neither of those conditions, right? Plus, as you mentioned, Dr. Sakhi, we have a history of the Taliban that did not moderate in the past. do you see any potential force, internal or external, that could lead to the Taliban moderating in the near future?
But I still see that international community, including the United States, has some leverage to enforce. And those leverage is the recognition and the money. Though there are people who actually, there are analysts who argue that Taliban don't need money and recognition. I have a counter argument on this. I think that they have gained this recognition from last 2.5 years now, and they want to have this recognition. It's important for them. They don't want to be isolated from the world this time. That's one thing that they are pushing. And the face that they are even showing right now, which I always say, please don't trust Taliban at this particular time, because they are in the consolidating power phase. And during this phase, when the parties say anything, throughout the case studies around the world we have seen, that cannot be trusted, because they are seeking and they are struggling for establishing themselves. And once they establish themselves, they will get back to what they have been doing before. So, or they get back to their previous ideology. So therefore, trusting them at this particular time is not a good move, though there should be conditionality. Well, there are, possible scenarios that we are thinking about. Conditionality of funding, conditionality, recognition at this point is very early. They shouldn't be recognized at this particular time, especially now with this interim system, when they have this Akani group in power, and when even there's fragmentation within them, between them. And fragmentation is again based on exclusivity, because they're all non-Kandaharis are not, even in Pashtun, among Pashtun, non-Kandaharis are not part of their system, their government or whatever organization they put in place. And they're all hardliners from Paktika and Helmand, that most of them Pashtuns from those cities. So even the fragmentation within their own tribe and ethnicity should give a lot to the world, what kind of a system they envision and they will put in place. So therefore, what I would see that the conditionality, at least for the time being, should work. And then for the long term, I would see, creating an enabling environment for elections. Even it seems impossible at this particular time with an authoritative system like Taliban in place. But in Afghanistan, everything has been played as a pilot project. Why not proposal of elections under an authoritative system like Taliban, that it's not in place right now, it's kind of interim from their lens. Why not opportunities to, why not this discussion should start happening from now? And why not there should be push from the international community going forward, specifically when UN is involved. UN is involved right now in the humanitarian assistance, and UN will be involved going forward with the humanitarian assistance. So I think this time that I would see that lens could give some kind of hope, and then inclusion, then different ethnic representation. That might work under such scenario. Other than that, if there will be a recognition of this particular system that they put in place without any conditionality, without any possible scenarios in mind, and pushing those scenarios, I think that would be a mistake.
Thank you. So this seems to be a unique, important moment that maybe we could take advantage of. With all its problems, there might be a chance to influence the Taliban and maybe call for elections. Why not? Why not try? So thank you. Mr. Noori?
Yes, I would say that if, I think the question was about modernization of Islamist groups.
Moderation as well.
Moderation, sorry. But the core problem with these groups, so-called Islamic groups, is women. Once they actually, I'm saying problem for them, because actually they think that women are a problem for them. So I think once the world is is able to convince them to respect women's rights, I think a big part of the problem will be solved, because now you see they're ruling Afghanistan and the only issue that comes out is about women, because they want women not to go out, they want women not to work, they want women not to be educated, though they haven't said it 100%, but even in the universities, they have separated classes, and public universities has not started yet, but some private universities, they have actually put curtain in the classes. So basically, I would say the problem with such groups, why don't they impose a lot of things on men? Because the core problem is women for them. And if think about moderation of these groups, I think the amount of leverage world has, I agree with Dr. Sakhi that now they need economic support, and also they need recognition internationally. They could probably somehow use it in a good way to impose on them, the wealth and the demands, but I highly doubt it that they will continue doing so and accepting what the international community says, because now, as you know, the power of the world has divided into different parts. Now there is China, there is Russia, there is Iran and Pakistan, who is likely to support the Taliban, and then there's Western countries who believe in some sort of regulations and human rights and children and women rights. So I think even Western countries, even though they don't support the Taliban, now they have other rooms to use.
Thank you. These are very important, good points. And I think to add to that, the ability to influence of Western countries, the situation in Afghanistan is complicated, and particularly recently, August 29th, the drone strike that has killed an aid worker in Afghanistan who was just carrying water. These kinds of things really complicate the ability of the United States to say that they stand for human rights and to demand that of the Taliban. I have one last question for you. There's a lot to talk about, but what is one thing you believe that is missing from public discussion that you think we should be paying more attention to if we are to better judge the situation in Afghanistan?
Well, if we talk from a realism perspective, what I would see is missing from the, and I think it's too early. Maybe I am I'm jumping ahead, but I would see to the world should talk, and the Afghans also should talk about alternatives, because Talibanism and Taliban system is not a solution to the country, to Afghanistan. The Taliban, organization or any kind of government will never establish a stable political system in Afghanistan, and will never end the protracted conflict and conflict overall in the country. So that is not a solution to the country. That will not solution to respond to other major transnational threats that could emerge from the country as well. So with the Taliban system in place, I would imagine that we will have the emergence of new transnational, traditional and untraditional threats going forward. I would also imagine that there will be a new version of terrorism emerge from both the politics of the Taliban and the socioeconomic crisis that will emerge under Taliban system. So looking at all these future possible threats, I would imagine that scenario of future alternatives or other alternatives, that discussion should happen from now. And yes, I am certainly not against, I'm not in favor of any kind of war, any kind of armed conflict. I'm just opposing all kinds of armed conflict for Afghanistan, because that will cause further suffering and destruction. But I'm for any kind of political settlement that could provide alternative to Taliban system, because I would imagine the Taliban system is not, again, gonna guarantee a stable Afghanistan going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. So you're saying take a step back, see the big picture, what's happening is unsustainable, and have a plan, have ideas for the future beyond just defeating Taliban. That's very helpful. Thank you. Mr. Noori?
Yeah, thank you. That's what Doctor mentioned, which is quite fair enough. But I think also, there is a mistrust now on US and other countries who left Afghanistan in such a mess. We were not expecting this to happen, but now it's the time for them to once again actually get themselves involved in the country, not militarily, but they have other ways to ask the Taliban and for an inclusive government. And I think the ideology the Taliban have is quite different with the ideology of most of Afghans. Probably they would think the way 2% of whole population of Afghanistan thinks. So I think I pretty much agree with her that there should be an alternative, and Taliban cannot rule the country. They don't have enough literate people, and they are really engaged within themselves and in tribal issues and leadership issues, and they will not be someone who can actually provide the ground and pave the ground for a better future, having proper system on place. Thank you.
And Yelena, just in addition to what I said and Mr. Noori also highlighted, I would like to reflect on the economic and humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, which are unfolding. I receive calls from a number of people from across the country, and there are severe economic and humanitarian crisis in the country. And I think the international community, this is a time that I'm glad UN already started initiating some of the major activities actually to address this particular issue. But I think more efforts from international community at this particular time should be on this humanitarian and economic crisis inside the country, finding ways. I'm not actually for legitimizing Taliban at this particular time, but other ways and methods in order to address some of the unfolding events which are happening right now. And lots of attention should be on the human security, on the people's security in the country right now, which people are really screaming and asking for help at this particular time. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think this is the perfect place to end on this very important point that you made about the humanitarian crisis and just the ordinary people in Afghanistan. I want to thank everyone again, Mr. Noori and Dr. Sakhi, for joining me in this important conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Take care. Thanks. Bye.